independence, love, social convention, gender roles, and religion. Charlotte Bronte's most famous novel challenges ideas on all these topics, and we are here to discuss it. I'm Charlene.
And I'm Mike.
And this is Jane Eyre Files. Chapter 3. Such Dread as Only Children Can Feel. Hello, husband.
Hello, infantine Guy Fawkes.
Wow, so underhanded. I'm so underhanded. It's funny that you mentioned Guy Fawkes, since I feel like that's a comment that's made that I always kind of gravitate towards, because it's a little bit humorous of Jane to think of herself, or think of Abbott thinking of herself like that.
And it's funny because we're recording this episode at the end of October, so we're coming up upon the 5th of November. Yes.
So with Chapter 3, I'm going to share the Spark Notes summary. When she wakes, Jane finds herself in her own bedroom in the care of Mr. Lloyd, the family's kind apothecary. Bessie is also present, and she expresses disapproval of her mistress's treatment of Jane. Jane remains in bed the following day, and Bessie sings her a song. Mr. Lloyd speaks with Jane about her life at Gateshead, and he suggests to Jane's aunt that the girl be sent away to school, where she might find happiness. Jane is cautiously excited at the possibility of leaving Gateshead. Soon after her own reflections on the past in the Red Room, Jane learns more of her history when she overhears a conversation between Bessie and Miss Abbott. Jane's mother was a member of the wealthy Reed family, which strongly disapproved of Jane's father, an impoverished clergyman. When they married, Jane's wealthy maternal grandfather wrote his daughter out of his will. Not long after Jane was born, Jane's parents died from typhus, which Jane's father contracted while caring for the poor. So this chapter introduces, for the first and last time, a character that I always really liked, in particular in the 1973 adaptation, which is, again, my favorite. Mr. Lloyd in there is such a kindly person, and that's something that I appreciate about him, especially in this beginning of the book, where you really... everyone is mean to Jane, and finally someone is actually nice, wants to help her and talk to her like a kindly way. He's such a welcome relief from the antagonistic and indifferent people around Jane.
I dare say she's crying because she could not go out with Mrs. in the carriage.
Oh, what nonsense at her age, such pettishness.
I hate going out in the carriage. I cry because I'm miserable.
Oh, fie, miss.
Yeah, I feel like I put in my notes that this is Jane's first ally, right? Mm-hmm. You know, I'm a little sad that apparently you said this is the last mention of him. Spoiler, he's not going to be around much more in the book.
Well, I should say there is another mention of him, but you don't see him, actually. He just gets written to.
Yeah, but I mean, it's no coincidence that we finally have somebody who's patient with her, who wants to listen to her. And I have the exact quote that Jane says. She says, "An individual not belonging to Gateshead and not related to Mrs. Reed."
Yeah.
So it's like, that's what it takes, right?
Yes.
Yeah. And I mentioned it like the very first two lines of dialogue that he has in the book, I thought were really charming. And they're just throwaway lines, maybe. Mm-hmm. You know, maybe Charlotte didn't put too much thought into them. But it's just the way it sets up that character in the warp. Like you said, maybe he's somebody that could be, like I mentioned, an ally, but somebody who's actually going to pay attention, who's going to give Jane the benefit of the doubt and hear what she has to say. And the very first thing he says when Jane looks at him, and he basically just says, "Well, who am I?" And I like that. Like, it's something you would say to a 10-year-old kid, right? If you could tell that you see puzzled bewilderment on their face, then you're just like, okay, you know who I am. Well, who am I? And then after she says his name, then his line is, "We shall do very well by and by." And I like that. It's a good motto to live by. Like, he's like, okay. I mean, I'm sure it's a weird circumstance for him to be here, because that's a question I'm going to ask you in a second. Is why is she being treated by an apothecary and not a physician? But It's like, so I think he understands. Okay, why am I'm only here because the aunt doesn't really want to spring for the physician. So, well, we'll try very well by and by. Let's see what we can do, and I'm here to listen to you, I guess, right?
Yes, I was thinking about the fact that Jane is being treated by an apothecary, and Jane makes a point of saying that for the Reed family, Mrs. Reed always employs a physician, and the fact that apothecary is a lower-ranking medical practitioner at that time. They were basically a pharmacist, and they prescribed medicines. And actually, in Haworth, where Charlotte Bronte and her family grew up, there's an apothecary down the street, and that's a place that Branwell used to visit to get some laudanum to while away the time, I suppose. But I wonder how familiar Charlotte was with an apothecary and how often they saw a physician. Because that must have been more expensive, perhaps, or I don't know if maybe it was hard to find a physician in Haworth because it's a very remote place. But it is unfortunate that Jane is relegated to the apothecary, which, as Jane says, was also called in for servants at the Reed household. So basically, Mrs. Reed doesn't really care about Jane.
Yeah, and then, we're only in the third chapter now. We're still establishing that backstory, right? And so it's yet another instance of that mistreatment, of that, Jane being treated like a second-class citizen.
Yes.
I know I mentioned it on previous episodes, but it was like, this could all, in a way, be one big chapter. I feel like there's slight differences. It can be, those chapters where you'll see a break that has like a little horizontal line. Like it's still all the same chapter,
sure.
but it's like, okay, she's being mistreated at home. The first chapter was basically John Reed striking her, right? The main thing we took out of that, and then her being punished for being struck. And then the second chapter is just her in the red room going over how she's being mistreated, and then the element of the supernatural. And then this chapter is her talking to someone about her mistreatment. So it's all just variations of that. We're still, we're not... Charlotte's taking her time setting up the narrative of what it's like. Because I feel like it happens a lot with... I mean, it happens a lot with movies. I don't know about books, but that
moves
if it's
more quickly.
Yeah, where it's just like, I want to kind of get an idea of what their normal everyday life is like before all the dramatic elements start to come into play. And I think with this, it was to me, I had a hard time with this chapter just because it was a little repetitive. It was like, okay, now we know as the reader what she's dealt with. So now we have to hear her recount the story to somebody else. And even if it is a character that we want to like.
Yes.
So, but it's like, I wonder if it would have just been easier for her to just have a couple of sentences and said, I told my story to
that's
Mr. Lloyd, and then they could have what's Mr. Lloyd going to do about it? Yeah. Yeah,
I could see your point because, in a way, if Charlotte Bronte had wanted to move the story a little further, she didn't have to have a Mr. Lloyd suggest, because this encounter with Mr. Lloyd basically sets up the idea of Jane going to school, which apparently Mrs. Reed hasn't thought of. But if Charlotte Bronte had wanted to, she could have just had Mrs. Reed come up with the idea, and then we could have moved the story along. But I don't know. I do like Mr. Lloyd. Maybe Charlotte Bronte had a soft spot for someone who reminded her of Mr. Lloyd.
Oh, sure.
And just included him in the story. But you're right. I feel like, this chapter is it's short, and it has a lot of information about Jane's parents.
Yeah.
But in a way, it could have been skipped over.
Well, and it's weird. We talked about it on our chapter 1 episode, is that we get backstory in the form of an insult by John Reed hurled at Jane. And now we're finally learning a little bit about Jane's parents, and it's through a secondhand conversation that she's just overhearing.
And sadly, this is the first time she heard it about how her parents died and everything. That seems really unfortunate too.
And so I feel like, I mentioned that this is all sometimes it seems like it's one big chapter, but I could see this being the end of that one big chapter, because now we're starting to see what I like to call, I put it in my notes that I said, we're seeing a turn in the narrative finally. There's finally, it's life at home, blah, blah, blah. But now we see this idea of, would you want to go to school? And that's the first intro, because you're just like, okay, because I guess this is what happens when you read books. You're constantly looking, what's the next setting going to be? Where's the next scenario going to take place? I assume it happens with movies as well. You don't want to see two people, or even if it's a group of people in the same location. It's like, okay, where are they going to go next?
Sure.
And so the whole time you're reading this, you're like, okay, Jane's in this big house with this family that doesn't like her and all these servants. Now what? And so you finally get the first inkling of like, oh, there's going to be a school if she so chooses, And I imagine at that time, would the kids want to go to school? I mean, like it's especially for her situation, maybe get her out of the house, but like, it wasn't always provided for everybody, right?
I suppose. I mean, obviously Jane is going to be a governess, so she's been employed to teach at home at someone's house. So that's an option for people who have a little more money. But I think that Jane describes it pretty well in the book about how she didn't hear a lot of great things about school through John, but then the accomplishments seemed like it would be worth it to go, where she can learn all these interesting things. The other options she had to her apparently weren't as appealing, whether she would go with her other set of family, which might be a beggarly sort, and she doesn't want to be a beggar.
Or she could stay at the Reed house and become assimilated.
Oh,
like would that be appealing to her at all? Or is she, eventually, unless she's hoping that they're going to change their tune, otherwise she's going to be the one's going to have to change. And so maybe it's like, maybe I'd be better off taking my chances with school and make some friends and all that stuff.
When I was young, there was a time when I enjoyed going to school, and I looked forward to it.
You would. Yeah.
It was fun to learn new things.
I like PE class.
Ooh, I did not enjoy PE class.
Yeah. But no, I mean, also what's funny is, again, I think the biggest takeaway from this chapter is the very end with learning about her parents.
Yeah.
And I was absolutely fascinated by this because, Jane is our protagonist and we want to side with her on every argument. We want to have the same kind of mindset that she does. And yet this is the first time that we see, in my opinion, Jane passing judgment on others. With her, she has these views on poverty and poor people. And that comes as it was like it came out of nowhere, because you're just supposed to believe that, it's this good-natured kid and she's complaining about how things are unfair. Mm-hmm. But then yet she's just like, I don't want to be around poor people.
Yes.
And I don't want to.
Points are a little harsh.
Yeah. And so my thought was like, is that the Reed influence? Is that being in that house for how many years? Did we establish how old she was when she came into the Reed's possession?
I think she was a baby.
Was she still a baby? So she's been there for 10 years.
Yeah.
But there's that expression, nature versus nurture, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that's what it is. And I just thought it was very surprising from our heroine, but it's also, is it to be expected from a child of that era? She's living a quasi-privileged life. Mm-hmm. And so it's just, it was a little bit, I don't want to say unsettling, because I'm sure
she's a child.
She's a child, and I'm sure it's probably what you have to deal with. You don't want to be around poor people, but at the same time, it's like we know in the future, we know what she's going to be dealing with, mm-hmm. and we know what a lot of people of that era were dealing with. And you're like, I'm sure a lot of people who are poor didn't want to be poor,
right?
And so
and it doesn't reflect on their character, which is I think something that she seems to feel at that time.
Yeah, and I was a little bit jarring. But then when the story comes around and you learn more about her parents, my first thought was, does she blame the poor for her parents' deaths? Oh, because that's where her father caught typhus while treating the poor, and then passed it to his mother, and then they're both not with us. So then you're like, okay, maybe is this, I don't know. I thought it was kind of a cheap way for Charlotte to say, oh, this little kid's going to have these really harsh views on poor people. And then it's like, oh, but here's how she feels. This is probably why she feels that way. So that you can kind of go, okay, maybe it's a little bit more understandable. Because you want to excuse kids sometimes for their behaviors and for their views.
Yes.
But when this is the title character in your novel, there's a part of me that thinks like she's supposed to just be so virtuous and stuff. But yet Charlotte throws that out there that like, oh yeah, she didn't like poor people, and then says, but poor people killed her parents. And now it's like, and it's like, oh, okay.
I see your point. I also feel like the way that Charlotte Bronte wrote it is that Jane, as an adult, is saying these things that she said as a child, but I don't know, you get a sense that adult Jane doesn't feel the same way.
Sure.
So it is more focused the fact that she's a child and she doesn't really know everything. And probably, like you said, Mrs. Reed's viewpoints, which I can assume that she probably didn't like poor people, was reflected a little bit.
I reflected. Poverty looks grim to grown people, still more so to children. They have not much idea of respectable poverty. They think only of ragged clothes, scanty food, and rude manners. Poverty for me was synonymous with degradation.
No, I should not like to belong to poor people.
Not even if they were kind to you?
I was not heroic enough to purchase liberty at the price of caste.
But it was a little save. That's what I'm saying. They just she put a little line in there. She didn't have to say that I think my parents died because of typhus that they got from poor people. And I say she, meaning Charlotte Bronte didn't have to put that in there. But it was like just a little tag on there to be like, okay, maybe this might explain some of Jane's feelings. Which
I also feel like that Charlotte Bronte has to make sure that Jane is not going to want to go with these other set of relatives. So, okay, we'll make them poor. Because otherwise, if Jane did go with her other set of relatives, it's going to be a completely different story.
If only someone would have written like a choose your own adventure style book about Jane Eyre, where you could see what would have happened if she had gone to the poor family. My wife Charlene wrote a choose your own adventure book about Jane Eyre.
I did. I wrote a very, very compact choose your own adventure where I don't go into Jane discovering her lost relatives early on, but I played around with a few other things. And
that's for the sequel.
Oh yeah. Well, I could do a new edition and make and add some more chapters.
Yeah.
There's something else in this book that I find really interesting, which is the song that Bessie sings to Jane, the Poor Orphan Child poem, which is an original poem that Charlotte Bronte wrote. The first stanza begins, "My feet they are sore, and my limbs they are weary. Long is the way, and the mountains are wild. Soon will the twilight close moonless and dreary over the path of the poor orphan child." And I think it starts off something that you will find throughout the book, which is foreshadowing, something that Charlotte Bronte includes a lot in this book. And in this poem, Bessie seems to make almost a direct comment on Jane as she is an orphan. And it seems to show how Bessie feels sorry for her, because it's such a sad song about how lost this poor orphan child is.
I mean, it's right on the nose, right?
It's
very
on the
little
nose.
on the nose, yeah. But
yeah, so the whole poem sort of foreshadows the whole book to me as I read it, which with the child sent away somewhere far and lonely, which would be Lowood, and the comfort and hope to the poor orphan child reminds me of Thornfield Hall. And the fourth stanza mentions straying in the marshes by false lights beguiled, which prefigures Jane wandering the moors and how she sees some lights that lead her to the rivers. That's not too much of a spoiler.
I'm assuming you've read the book.
Yes. And so, but the ending is very dark, with the child basically saying she'll find peace when she is dead and in heaven, which, another spoiler, that's not what happens at the end of Jane Eyre.
Well, did we get an establishment of a source of this poem?
What do you mean? Charlotte Bronte wrote it.
But I mean, Bessie is reciting it.
It seems that she is singing it like it's a common folk song.
Like I said, she would have just overheard it in the town square, or someone would have taught it to her in a music class or something.
Yes, because then I think before this poem is mentioned, it's quoted that Bessie is singing this song about gypsying a long time ago, and that I think is an actual old song from that time period.
Is that okay?
So Charlotte Bronte is weaving them together.
Well, I mean, I think we've established that it's Victorian era England, and I'm sure that the maids and servants, there's only so much to do in a day's time.
Oh, you're cleaning all day,
yeah,
so you want to sing?
You're going to be singing to yourself, right?
Yeah.
I guess, and she's just not just singing to herself; she's singing to Jane in that, right?
Well, I suppose. I mean, I kind of envision that Jane is just sitting there while Bessie's cleaning, so she's kind of just
she's not serenading. She's not serenading her.
No,
because I mean, how would you would sing a song to a person about an orphan child to an orphan child? That seems a little bit crude.
Yes. Jane doesn't realize she's an orphan child. No.
Let me remind you
Yeah.
in 4/4 time here, But yeah, it seems like a very interesting choice of poem to read, unless it's something where, or I should say, a song to sing based on a poem, unless it gives you comfort, or unless there's a bright, but like I said, it's not really a happy ending necessarily.
No, although it does seem to give Jane comfort, maybe just because she also feels sad. Sometimes when you're melancholy, something melancholy will make you feel better because it's in the same mood.
Yeah, I mean, Bessie could have at least changed the end, though. Yeah.
Just stop the poem before you get to the end.
Yeah, how many stanzas are this poem, Bessie? Just 3. Just 3. Really? Okay.
So, well, I think that we should highlight foreshadowing when we hit upon it in the coming chapters. I think it's very intriguing how Charlotte Bronte weaves it into the story.
Oh, yeah. I mean, because again, this is being told from a retrospective point of view, right?
Yes.
I mean, have we established, this is the 19-year-old. No, she's probably older than 19 as she's reciting the story, right?
She's 10 years removed from the events at the end of the book, so she's about 30 now, I guess.
So, yeah. So I think it's easy to have foreshadowing. You're not just, the story's not unfolding in real time, right? She's going to tell you, so she's going to probably drop in some hints. Even if it confuses readers like me, where she drops in hints about the light on the outside when she's in the red room, and here I thought that it was Jane thinking that she knew what was outside, and you had to remind me by saying, "Oh no, that's Charlotte, that's Jane's adult self explaining supernatural phenomenon away." But yeah.
Mm-hmm. So in the beginning of this episode, we mentioned Guy Fawkes, and I wanted to bring up that quote again. The quote, Abbott, I think, gave me credit for being a sort of infantine Guy Fawkes, which I find is a funny. There's moments of humor in Jane Eyre that I feel like is overlooked sometimes, but Jane has a very wry sense of humor, and the fact that she said, "Oh, Abbott must have thought I was Guy Fawkes, who was responsible for the gunpowder plot of 1605, which was a failed assassination attempt against King James I." I think it's, very famously celebrated that it was a failed assassination attempt with fireworks and burning of effigies in England now. And
they don't. Is it every 5th of November? They still celebrate it to this day.
Yes.
Like, I feel like I'm a weird, I'm not quite the Anglophile that you are, and I didn't really know much about this until V for Vendetta, right?
So I've not seen that movie, but I think it. Yeah, I knew that it was somehow related to.
The guy wears a Guy Fawkes mask and stuff, and that's what I had to look that up, and everyone was like, "Oh yeah, remember the 5th of November." Like,
is that a British movie?
I mean, it's filmed there, but it was the Wachowskis, right? They did The Matrix.
Oh, I see. Okay,
but it's Hugo Weaving. Plays their main character. Plays
right.
I think his name is V, but it's got your boy Stephen Fry and.
Oh yes,
Natalie Portman and stuff, who's almost British, but yeah, it's so it's and I think the longer that I've been with you, I know how fascinated you are with the English royal family and stuff, and I've always asked you. I know was it a book that you read that was about the history of all the different monarchs in England?
Oh,
and
right.
I find myself asking you all the time, "Oh, who's this one? Which one's Charles? Which one's James? Which one's?" And then when we went to
so many kings and queens, it's hard to remember.
And when we went on our honeymoon, we went to England, and we went to, I think it was the Tower, right? Tower of London. Is that where all the monarchy history was, basically? And so I had to look this up too, especially since I chose infantine Guy Fawkes as my opening line. But it was like, oh wow, this is political intrigue, but also religious intrigue, right? This would have been, because Henry VIII is the one that brought the Church of England in because he wanted to get a divorce.
Yes.
And then this is probably some subsequent kings, right? James is going to be after Henry, I take it, and that the Catholics weren't too thrilled, and they wanted to try to retake the throne, and so. Yeah, it's weird, religion, man. I'm surprised that religion would bring about violence. I didn't.
What?
I know
that's crazy.
I didn't expect that whatsoever. Also, we're 3 chapters in, we get yet another bird reference. Early in the chapter, I guess when she's recovering, Bessie or Abbott gives her a tart. And on the plate, it says there's a bird of paradise. And, naive me, I did not realize, I guess bird of paradise is a plant.
Oh, right.
But yet it's still a bird. And for the sake of for the sake of
said
this,
bird.
she says bird. It's bird is written in there because what's interesting is that when she's referring to the tart on the plate, she also refers to the bird of paradise, and she references the plumage, which I would think plumage is a term you would refer to a bird, not a plant. You don't look at the plumage of a rose.
So it's just so it's like another subtle hint about birds.
More birds.
Yeah, that Charlotte likes to drop in, I guess.
Yeah, but it's so funny because it was just so quick. I couldn't help but notice it because it was so early in the chapter, but otherwise I'm like, there's another bird.
Yeah, bird watch over here.
Bird Watch 3.0. That'll be the Bird Watch segment at the end of each episode. But also at the end of each episode, we always like to kind of discuss some sort of quote or passage that's meaningful to us from this chapter. And Charlene, I'm going to let you go first from chapter 3. What was the meaningful passage or quote that you had?
So my quote is, Bessie asked if I would have a book. The word book acted as a transient stimulus, and I begged her to fetch Gulliver's Travels from the library. So I picked this quote because, like Jane, books also bring me joy, and it would act as a transient stimulus for me if I was sad. And I also actually bought a bookmark that has that quote on it from Haworth Parsonage, and I'll throw a picture of that up on the old Instagram if you guys want to follow.
Nice.
So, that made me think about, books obviously do bring me a lot of comfort, and Jane Eyre has brought me a lot of comfort over the years. But I was curious, what brings you comfort in terms of different types of media? Like, what do you go to for comfort?
Yeah, it's funny because we've discussed I went to film school, but I don't necessarily comfort myself by throwing on movies.
That's very strange to me.
Well, just because of the fact that I had this conversation with a few of my friends who are also movie buffs. I don't like to watch a movie if I can't finish it. Mm-hmm. Like, I know people that
can't just dip in for.
Yeah, I know people that could start a movie at night and then finish it in the morning. I can't do that. I gotta finish the whole thing. In the interest of full disclosure, I will tell the listeners right now that I had surgery about a week ago to correct some issues with my nose. If my voice sounds a little funny, and so I've been recovering at home, and I've only watched one movie since I've been home, and I've been on the couch, taking painkillers and antibiotics.
Yeah.
And the only movie that I watched was a Pixar movie that you had already seen, and so I was like, good, I can watch it without you. It was called Brave, and I thought it was really good. But I made a list of all these movies, and I find myself I'm going more for bite-sized stuff. I'm going more for half-hour documentaries. I love live sports. That's sort of like my comfort because it's good background. It's good background noise. I used to love. On Monday nights, I would work. I'd come home and I'd put Monday Night Football on in the background while I was making dinner. Even I don't even care who's playing. It's just sort of there. But as far as in the media that you've described, books, movies, music, the go-to comfort for me, it's got to be music.
Right.
And also the fact that there are so many genres of music, and I like the fact that I like them all, or at least a great majority of them. I can appreciate them. Charlene, I don't know if you know this about her. She is a huge fan of heavy metal. And so,
wow, I guess you don't know me.
That's what gets her going in the morning. Because I kid. No, she doesn't like that. I like it all. I know not to listen to heavy metal or old school hip hop around her if I can help it.
I have my preferred genres, and Mike has a wider array of genres that he listens to.
Yeah, but I think that's what I like about it is there's a time and a place for certain genres based on your mood. And
or
I think
when I'm not in the house.
Well, not even that. It's like you said. The question was, "What's my go-to comfort?" And I used to always make this joke that back before iPods were so readily available and everybody had a CD player in their car, I used to always tell my friends, especially here in Los Angeles, you should always have a Bob Marley CD in your CD wallet, because if you're stuck in traffic, Bob Marley is such a great. It's a comfort for that, and so now it's like, well, I can just fire up my iPod and I can find some reggae music.
Oh yeah, you can have any kind of music that you want at the tip of your.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And then that's why there's some days where if you're having a rotten day, that I would put on something a little bit heavy. I might put on some Rage Against the Machine or Metallica or Tool, where you're just like, okay, I need something a little bit aggressive to get us out of my system. I like listening to music when you're working out,
Oh, sure. It motivates you, yeah.
Yeah, and I often said another music recommendation. I think one of the best bands to listen to when exercising is New Order, because it's like techno-y dance music, but it's got a beat, and you can kind of keep the rhythm of it. It's great to listen to when you're on a treadmill because you can step in time. No, Mary Poppins reference.
That's another song that you don't listen to.
Yeah, that's a good one to work out too as well. But and so there's just some days where you're like, okay, I want to hear Marvin Gaye. Where it's like, okay, I'm in that mood, and so that's why it's a perfect comfort for me because it's so all encompassing, and I like so many genres, and I have so many speakers in the house that I can put it on somewhere, or I can just say I'm going to put headphones on.
Yes,
and so that's my long-winded answer to your simple question, Charlene.
Well, I'm glad to know it. Obviously, there was a time when I wasn't feeling well, and you read Jane Eyre to me, so that Jane Eyre is comfort to me. I appreciate that.
It's so bizarre. If I'd have played some music for you, that wouldn't have done it. But by reading a little bit of Jane Eyre, all of a sudden...
Oh, yeah. So much better.
Okay.
So what's your quote?
Okay, there were a couple that stuck out to me, but this is the one that I really liked. Children can feel, but they cannot analyze their feelings. And if the analysis is partially affected in thought, they know not how to express the result of the process in words.
Somehow I thought you would pick that quote.
Really?
Actually, because it's a great quote.
I like that.
And I think that Jane's inability to express herself is a funny contradiction to the fact that she is expressing herself very well through words now while she's writing this story.
Yeah. I definitely feel like that quote could explain some of Jane's frustrations with her situation with the Reed family. And I guess 10-year-olds have to deal with that, right? It's like, how do you get your thoughts across? Even if, like you said, she's a very well-spoken adult, she has to get to that point. And so right now, it's like when you're the little kid and no one's listening to you, even what I like about this chapter is, yes, she finally has this ally in Mr. Lloyd. She finally gets to talk to him. But there's definitely some elements that I was reading in the chapter, and let me know if I'm wrong or what your opinion is on this, where I felt like Mr. Lloyd didn't believe her.
Yeah, because he still regards her as a child, and there's a little bit of a twinkling of humor in the way that he addresses her fears because he thinks that is childish and not realistic.
He's patronizing, right? I mean, I think that's
a good word. That's what I was going for.
Well, there's a lot. I'm sure that's what happens. Again, we've mentioned in other shows. Charlene and I do not have children, but I would imagine if that day should come, there's going to be a lot of moments where you're going to talk down to them because you're just like, oh, okay, well, they don't understand.
Right.
They can't analyze their feelings.
So before we wrap up this show, I wanted to share to the listeners that on my website, airguide.com, I will be posting additional thoughts that I have on each chapter of the book, something that I didn't remember to bring up that I really wanted to talk about. So you can visit that website. And I mentioned before that if any kind listeners would leave us a review on any of the podcast platforms that they listen to the show on, we might read it on the show. And I saw today we got a 5-star review from Sammy3568 on Apple Podcasts, and I wanted to read it because it was very nice. It's titled Cute Fun Podcast for Lovers of Jane Eyre. The cutest podcast. I love Jane Eyre, and it's so nice to listen to someone talk about it who loves the book as much as I do, and also someone who is reading it for the first time. Which I very much appreciate your comment, Sammy.
Yes. Thank you, Sammy.
Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed our podcast, please subscribe and leave us a review on your preferred podcast platform. This really helps us grow and reach new listeners. If you want to talk Jane Eyre with me online, you can find me on Twitter and Instagram at AirGuide. That's EYRE.
And if you want to hear more from me, I host my own podcast called Out of Touchstone, where my good friend Chad and I discuss all of the films that Disney produced for their Touchstone Pictures label. You can also find me on Twitter at Mike DeKalb.
Thank you, and farewell for the present.